an honor to be joined by such a fantastic panel. Let me just introduce myself briefly, if that hasn't happened already. I'm Matt Nelson, and I'm based in the Asia Institute here at the University of Melbourne. Today's webinar is produced in conjunction with the National Center for Contemporary Islamic Studies at the University of Melbourne, as well as the Asia Institute's flagship publication, the Melbourne Asia Review. And it grows out of a recent special issue of the Melbourne Asia Review focused on inter and intra-Muslim differences across the Muslim world. Now today, we'll be joined by three very prominent guests, and I'm going to take a moment to introduce them. But first, let me just tell you why we're gathered together. We're going to talk about a theme that I think is very important and emerging and sort of crucial theme focused on patterns of activism in the Muslim world. And the Muslim world very broadly defined. As you will quickly appreciate, we have guests focused on the Middle East, South Asia, Australia, and so on. So the Muslim world very broadly defined, and we're going to be asking our guests to consider how issues of difference, especially forms of difference rooted in race and gender and sexuality, are understood and then addressed and contested in Muslim communities around the world. Which forms of activism have emerged to address these issues? And then drawing on our very wide range of expertise, do we see different approaches to difference emerging in different contexts? Arab contexts, non-Arab contexts, Muslim majority contexts, Muslim minority contexts, and so on. So turning to our guests, I'm delighted to welcome our first guest, Dr. Elizabeth Flynn, an Aboriginal Chinese-Malaysian Muslim researcher and currently the Vice Chancellor's Indigenous Postdoctoral Fellow in Media and Communications at RMIT. In her work, Dr. Flynn has examined several different strands of activism, particularly in Australia, including recent work on contemporary Muslim Australian artists and a recent article entitled Me Too, Stories from the Australian Movement. We're also very delighted to welcome Professor Karima Laachir, Director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at ANU, the Australian National University in Canberra. Dr. Laachir's work focuses on activism under authoritarian regimes, with a particular focus on the Middle East. And she'll be sort of illuminating for us patterns of activism in that part of the world. And finally, we're very lucky to have Jeff Redding with us. Jeff is a former dean of the Sheikh Ahmed Hassan School of Law at the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan, and now a senior fellow at Melbourne Law School. And he's the co-editor of a recent volume entitled Queer and Religious Alliances in Family Law, Politics, and Beyond. And he joins us today from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Welcome, all of you. And thank you very much for joining us. If you don't mind, I'd like to just start by asking each of you to just give us a brief sense of your own research, but with one particular question in mind, which is, what form does activism take in your work? What does activism mean in your work? And in particular, perhaps, how does activism or activists intersect with elements of Islam? So if you don't mind, perhaps we could just start with Jeff. Tell us a little bit about your work and activism.
So I've been doing research on law and legal institutions in India and Pakistan now for about 20 years. And I have another monograph out about non-official or unofficial private Muslim courts in India and their relationship with the state and how they structure secularism. I've been working on the issue of trans rights in Pakistan as that project was ending. So for about the past 10 years, well, maybe 5 years. And I first got interested in the issue when litigation started in the Pakistan Supreme Court in 2009. And then I subsequently, a few years later, had the opportunity to write on developments in the Pakistan Supreme Court, and then the other changes that were being sparked by that discussion in the court. So I think activism in this context can occur in so many different ways. And I think one of the ways that I see myself as an activist in my scholarship is because these areas of law, whether it be Muslim courts or private Muslim courts in India or trans rights in Pakistan, are so saturated in people's misconceptions and fears about Muslims and Islam, that just sort of showing the day-to-day mechanics of either how a legal institution works, who shows up, what their procedure is, this sort of mundane stuff, including in Pakistan, what are the issues, who are the plaintiffs, what were the procedures followed, what were the subsequent court hearings and legislative activities that happened, that just that simple information in a moment and a moment of like continuing moment of severe anxiety about Islam and Muslims, that for me is a kind of activism. I mean, trans rights is an incredibly complicated area, and it's incredibly complicated in an incredibly complicated place like Pakistan. So I think it's hard to know sometimes like what the right answer is. And I don't pretend to know because I'm neither trans nor am I Pakistani, but I think they're just elucidating the complexity of this issue is a kind of activism.
Awareness itself is activism in a sense.
Yeah.
Can I turn to Elizabeth and get a sense of your research and also how you see this notion of activism or activists in the context of your work?
Thank you. It's a really great question, Matt. I guess I want to start by saying that I am fairly new to the academy. I'm in a postdoctoral role. I finished my PhD last year, sort of beginning of this year. And I think for me as a Muslim, having an understanding of collective rights and responsibilities and having an understanding of justice within the framework of Islam means that I feel a sense of responsibility and accountability. Universities, the academy, education is a very elite institution, particularly in settler colonial societies like Australia. And that kind of sense of elitism, it's ironic that I've joined that, but I think also I feel like my role within that is to use those resources to benefit the collective. And for me, that comes from a sense of how I understand Islam, but also for me, particularly within the bounds of what is now the country Australia, within the bounds of this place as an Aboriginal person as well, I feel that sense of responsibility and accountability to kind of, I think we bandy about the word decolonize quite a bit, but I think to use resources, to use an elite institution like this for a collective good. I come from a religion and two cultures that are very collective by their nature. So the sense that there are rights and responsibilities, that there are rights from community that they have over individuals, and that I have responsibility to those collectives is important in my work. So, I mean, I think when I think about my work, I think it's important for us to kind of separate out two things here when we think about activism and the academy, and when we're thinking about Islam, is that there is secular work that gets done within universities, and there is activism, all of those sorts of things. I think that there is also within Islam, and I don't have the Islamic knowledge to be able to speak to this, but there are other people that can, that we do have frameworks for activism, that we do have frameworks for justice within that. But I think that it's important that we're clear that they are two different things.
So in a sense, using the positions that we have in the academy, but also other positions in our communities and sort of bringing the conversation together brings a sense of responsibility, but also an opportunity to sort of introduce ideas and introduce new concepts and introduce challenge in certain ways.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think I reverted to Islam, it's like over 20 years ago now. And I think for me as an Aboriginal person in this place and the history of colonialism and the history of dispossession, I think I have always struggled. I became a Muslim just after 9/11. So I think the politics of race and gender within Australian society and the discourse that was happening at that period of time was largely very frustrating for me, this sense of we just want to prove that we belong, all of those sorts of things. And I think we see that, more recently. I was just, thinking through this conversation and thinking about, the moment that we had in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement and how that spread around the world. And I was really privileged to be part of a conversation with Islamic scholars, an African-American Sheikha from the US, Aisha Prime, also with an African scholar from here, Sheikh Abdi Nur Weli, talking about we can't breathe, talking about Black Lives Matter and what an honor and what a responsibility that is for me as someone who comes from a community that is racialized as Black, to speak to other Black Muslims about what that means in this space here in this location, to think about activism and Islam.
Fantastic. I will come back to the issue of sort of transnational partnerships, but also what you mentioned earlier, that importance of place. But let's hear from Karima about her work in the Arab world and what activism means both for herself, but also for the activists in that part of the world.
Thank you, Matt. So following on from what Elizabeth was saying, I'm more interested in my work in informal activism. So when we talk about activism, usually it's about like formalized political activism within political parties, within a particular framework. What I'm interested in is pursuing bottom-up political activism through cultural actors, like cultural producers, like filmmakers, popular musicians, popular artists. I'm very much interested in form of activism that are widely circulated and that represent a diversity of visions and ideological orientations. And I think the cultural sphere is ideal because it does push for change, particularly under authoritarian regime in the Arabic-speaking world, which is the context I'm working on, where civil society activism is very much limited, censored, very much surveyed. Cultural producers have that kind of freedom to express criticism through artistic expressions, which usually are extremely smart in overcoming censorship, but also in bringing to the public certain vital and important issues about social change, political change. So what I've noticed in my work is that there is always a diversity of agenda in a sense, because cultural producers are very diverse. They come from different backgrounds, different ideological orientations, but they always push for social change because they, in a sense, the perception is that there could be no democratization, no political change if we don't have an egalitarian society, if we don't have the right of minorities, of women, and different various marginalized group. So it represents a space where the masses can come together and discuss in public, which is a space that is not very much available in authoritarian regime. So for example, if we watch a movie, particularly I'm very much interested in popular movies, not elitist one, somehow it has certain element where they do, in a sense, represent certain like state ideology because they have to overcome censorship, but they always bring in certain issues that are really important, for example, about women's rights or minority rights, that bring in a discussion to the public and instigate these discussions in newspaper columns, in blogs, in different kinds of media. And then that creates certain awareness of that issue that did not exist before. And again, attract attention to the wider repressive patterns that come from the state. So I think the cultural field is really important as a sphere to look at forms of theorizing about the political and understanding local and localized form of activism that come from the people themselves. Now, the second part of your question about how they relate to Islam, it's really fascinating because I think most of the cultural producers in the Arab world are leftist, on the leftist side of the political spectrum. So they do do talk and represent the everyday lived realities of Muslims, like popular Islam, but they are very critical of politicized Islam or Islamist political parties. They see them as having an agenda that is not progressive, which is something that I critique all the time in my work as well, because I think there is that kind of bias against political Islam in popular culture.
Excellent. I mean, what's fantastic about this panel is first of all, the geographic spread, right? From Australia to South Asia to the Middle East. And as I said earlier, I do have a question about the way in which the activists that you each engage, but also study, understand, if you will, the transnational dimensions of activism. Or we often hear that all politics is local. Right? And some of the most effective forms of expression that can take up important ideas and challenge convention and look for ways to promote change are actually crucially embedded very much in quite specific local contexts, which don't easily travel. And I'm wondering, given the geographic spread that we have in this panel, if you can sort of briefly reflect on the way activists in the context that you study think about activists in other contexts. Do they see themselves as part of making change in Muslim communities, either in a secular sense with a sort of a Muslim identity in a broad sense, or in a religious sense? Do they see themselves as part of transnational activist communities, or are they on the all politics is local side of that question? What have you found? And I think I'm going to start actually with Elizabeth this time. And the comments that you made earlier sort of raised this question. On the one hand, you talked about a sense of place, and on the other hand, you talked about your recent engagement during the Black Lives Matter activism with people around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can chew gum and walk at the same time, right? Like, I don't think that we have to have one or the other. I think that, the sense of what is happening locally and a sense of place, I think that that's one of the most important things that we can encourage when we are, I know in my work when I'm working with other people who might be community organizing, there's so much more nuance that comes to that. But I think that the people that I work with, and it might just be kind of the nature of the different communities that I literally live in and work within, I think that there is just a natural transnational approach to the way that we work. And also I think, even within the bounds of so-called Australia, the sense that we work across communities, I think that there is a sense of, particularly when you are in the minority or when you are not part of the powerful group, that there is power in numbers. So when you can come together, when you can build coalitions, or when you can build solidarity, that just gives you more power to be able to push back, right? But I think that maybe one good example might be around kind of organizing around this idea of Blackness, right? So if we think about race as a construct, it's not an actual biological, determination, that, Black people have been racialized as Black by primarily colonizers around the world at various points in history in different ways. In Africa, that happened to enslave people and take them to the New World. In Australia, there is more of a growing consciousness of a different type of slavery here, but really the racialization was to dispossess us of our land. So there's sort of different ways that Blackness has been used. If we think about places like South Asia, that people were racialized as Black there, but that notion has really fallen off as we have moved into kind of more contemporary times. But the organization or the kind of activism and the kind of work that can happen around the notion of Blackness you know, in the context of Australia, you still need local knowledge. You still need a local understanding of what the race politics are in this country, because it is about dispossession. It's also about eugenics, you know, and this idea that they were trying to breed out the Black in Aboriginal people, and the idea that I can experience disadvantage as a Black person, but there are, for example, African American people that would look at me and be like, you're not Black. I present as very Asian, right? But my Blackness is there, and that is how I organize against racial injustice. So you can't have an American race politics. You can't have a global place race politics. You have to have that local. But you also, there is strength in being able to work globally to be able to do that transnational work as well.
Can I turn to Karima? I mean, in this context, I'm thinking particularly within the Arab Middle East, right? And that transnational potential, in a sense, within the Arab context. And yet each country, each national context has its particularities. They have particular frameworks where the challenge is sort of shaped. And there is sometimes a sense that to the extent that we expand transnationally, we may have a sense of solidarity, but we might lose local effectiveness because we have to tailor our strategies to the particular national context within which we, and within activist communities, you sometimes see this tension. Should we go big? Should we stay local?
Yes, I think that's really a crucial question. I would say in the Middle East, I really agree totally with what Elizabeth was outlining there. I mean, race politics are very different from one country to the other. I think it's wrong to impose a certain American race politics on, let's say, the Middle East. I think that's really create more problems rather than address them, because each country has its own histories and localities. But I think when we talk about the transnational, as long as we don't have Western-centric or a Eurocentric agenda that come from that transnational, that is white dominated in a way when it comes to gay rights or trans rights or women's rights or minority rights, I think, because doing that causes more harm and alienate the people who are really suffering in, for example, in countries in the Middle East. An example of that is the question of women's rights. So there are many NGOs in the Arab world, in Tunisia and Morocco, in Lebanon, in Jordan, which are foreign funded. You know, they are funded either by some French funders or British ones or American ones, and they are viewed with a lot of suspicion from local people, from the masses, because they bring in an agenda for them that is foreign. Although the people who run the NGOs are very much aware of the challenges because they don't have funding. They have to accept, for example, foreign funding to run their services. They're aware of that and they try to outmaneuver the funders. It's always impossible because there is an agenda that comes with those kind of these types of funding that limit their activities and make them seen as Western affiliated, and that doesn't allow the furthering of certain issues, or in a sense tackling the grassroots, the problematic issues in the local communities. So I think as there is a sense of locally driven agenda that can then become a form of solidarity with what's happening with other parts of the world. I usually speak about South-South solidarity, that there are these communities where they get together because they know there are histories of colonialism, as Elizabeth was saying, a history of slavery, of settler colonialism, that allow them to speak with each other in a language that they understand. I think, but it doesn't limit us to have a transnational form of, in a sense, solidarity, but that is always aware of certain privileges, of certain agendas that dominate on a global scale, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, the potential of transnational solidarity comes with risks at the same time. And Jeff, if I can turn to you, your work is specifically focused on, in this case, constitutional litigation. It's focused on, the ways in which courts take up issues regarding trans rights, and then address them in the context of a local jurisdiction. And yet we know that both activists who are involved in some of these cases, but also judges who are looking at these cases, they're part of transnational networks as well. So on the one hand, the litigation is local, but the formulation of the questions, the response to those questions really does kind of balance sort of the local laws with a transnational sense of solidarity or borrowing of ideas. How do they work together?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's quite interesting about the Pakistan trans rights discussions, which has emerged, from 2009 onwards. Again, 2009 was when the first case was heard in the Supreme Court, and there had been a police raid on a party where several trans folks were present and they were arrested. And that sparked an activist litigator to bring a public interest litigation to the Supreme Court. And that subsequently spawned several years of hearings and orders and directives being issued from the court. I think what's so interesting about this particularly Pakistani development is that this discussion has been saturated in transnationalism, but particularly trans-regionality. And Pakistan has actually been an exporter of norms rather than a receiver or of either Western or South Asian best practices. So just to give a flavor of this, in 2014, the Indian Supreme Court, 5 years after the Pakistani Supreme Court, they heard a major case on trans rights, and this case is known as the Nalsa decision. So in this decision, there is a part of it in which the Indian Supreme Court mentions developments not only in Pakistan, but prior to Pakistan in Nepal. And I think in doing so, the Indian Supreme Court was saying, listen, this is a regional issue, and our neighbors, including Pakistan, have pushed forward on this, and we should be doing the same. Now, after that decision, there was legislation that was quickly sponsored in India, and forms of that legislation, trying to protect different rights of trans folks, then ended up being exported to Pakistan, where there were legislative proposals in Pakistan bearing remarkable language that was in some instances clearly just copied from Indian legislation. But India struggled to pass this legislation, and Pakistan, again, moving forward in 2018, passed the Pakistan Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 1 year before India passed this. And in many ways, the Pakistan legislation is held out as sort of the gold standard in the region because it protects gender self-declaration or gender self-identity, where the Indian legislation puts up formally a much more bureaucratic process for people to get their trans identity or their identity different than what they were born with recognized by authorities. Now, there's so many wrinkles to this regional story, but I talk about this in the article in the Melbourne Asian Review. One of the most interesting recent wrinkles is that litigation has been brought in the federal Sharia court in Islamabad, challenging the Islamic bona fides, if you will, of the 2018 Act in Pakistan. And the litigants who are clearly inspired by the Jamaat Islami, if not party members, they say that this gender self-declaration language in the 2018 should be rolled back, and that the Indian model of posing all these bureaucratic hurdles to gender self-declaration, that should be, that is the Islamic position on gender self-identification. So that, the politics here is, it's very transnational, it's particularly transregional, and the politics both on the gender side and the religion side both are just ricocheting back and forth between the two countries, between the two largest countries, India and Pakistan.
It's a really illuminating example, and actually refers back to what Elizabeth was saying and Karima. On the one hand, we see a regional exchange, right, with judges and legislators and activists basically closely aware of what the others are up to. And on the other hand, there's a little bit of a hot potato situation when it comes to acknowledging or embracing, if you will, the initiatives of outsiders. And so in both cases, there's an appreciation for the transnational dimension, but also a very strong appreciation for the limits of that connection.
I'll just say one very Pakistan-specific thing that has never entered the Indian discussion in a very prominent way is the inheritance rights of trans individuals. And so this has been part of the 2018 Act in Pakistan, and reflects the importance of Islamic inheritance norms and discussions around those norms in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan.
This actually brings me directly to something I also wanted to hear from you about, from all of you, which is this relationship between activists focusing on issues pertaining to gender and sexuality on the one hand, and on the other hand, religious leaders or religious discourse generally, particularly in Muslim contexts. Now, when Karima was speaking earlier, she said that most of the activists that she's focusing on are sort of on the left secular end of the spectrum. Of course, they're speaking to the everyday lived experience of Muslims, but not necessarily in a religious idiom. Whereas on the other hand, Elizabeth was telling us earlier that some of the key conversations she's had, particularly in her example pertaining to the Black Lives Matter movement, were coming from religious figures who are also Black Americans and so on, who are interested in sharing ideas that are framed by their professional experience with reference to religion. And so I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about what you've studied concerning this relationship between gender and sexuality activists on the one hand and religious leaders on the other hand. We're often told about bright boundaries between these two groups, but we also frequently run across examples of relatively blurry boundaries and interaction. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how you and your research have run across both bright and blurry boundaries in this context, religious leaders on the one hand and gender or sexuality activists on the other. I should say, yeah, let's start with Karima.
Yeah, so I mean, the perfect example for me is the work of women scholars, particularly coming from an Islamist feminist perspective, trying to reread the Quran and the hadith, the legacy of the Prophet saying, and to kind of reread it from a feminist perspective, because we all agree that in all the monotheistic religions, sacred texts have always been read by men, and of course they pursue a particular agenda that's very much marginalized the right of women. So what we've seen since the early 20th century is these feminist movements very much driven by this strong urge to reread the Quran and Hadith, and kind of shows the feminism of Islam, the feminism of the Quran and Hadith. Well, I think this has been hugely successful. It started in early 20th century in Egypt. Then, of course, it took off with the Iranian Muslim feminists after the Iranian Revolution, because that was a tactic to speak back to the theocracy that very much took away the right that women gained under the regime of the Shah. But then it accelerated in the 1980s and 90s. And we see it as a model that is very successful, that instead of the divide between secular feminists and Islamist feminists, they actually joined forces and started to push for an agenda for change that is very much inspired by Islam and Islamic ethics, Islam as seen as a religion of justice and solidarity and equality. And I think that's a perfect model for me when we talk about gender and sexuality in Islam, because they pushed really for a change of laws. I think they've been very successful in Morocco with the change of the family law in 2004, very much successful in Algeria. In Tunisia, they had, since the Bourguiba regime in 1956, they adopted a very secular personal code. But we've seen that with the post the 2011 uprising, when the Nahda started to try and change the family laws, the feminists pushed on both sides, the Islamist feminist and the secular one. So I think there is a kind of sense of a strong urge there to show the egalitarian aspect of Islam and Sharia, which is always misunderstood. When we talk about homosexual right or transgender right, that's a very difficult issue, because I think there is that presumption, particularly in Muslim majority country, that it's something that religious leaders cannot tackle because the masses are not yet prepared for that kind of discussion. But we see a lot of that in the diaspora. So we've seen of Muslim religious leaders in the diaspora pushing for a progressive agenda that recognize the equality and the right of queer and LGBT communities in the diaspora. But I don't see much of it in Muslim majority countries.
A perfect answer to the question that I posed. On the one hand, a really rich illustration of blurry boundaries, particularly with Islamic feminism and so on. But then on an issue basis, turning to sort of homosexual rights, transsexual, sort of transgender rights, there's a brighter boundary on some of those issues. So by issue, the brightness or the blurriness will vary. Can I turn to Jeff? Because you're working in the area that Karima just described as one of the areas of bright boundaries. And yet, you've talked about the example of Pakistan, where it was exactly in the area of transgender rights, where we saw significant movement, particularly through these Supreme Court judgments. But then also, as you've written in the Melbourne Asia Review, there's been a backlash. So again, a story of blurry boundaries turning towards some bright boundaries at the end. Can you bring us into that narrative?
Yeah, so let me just preface all this by saying that, I think the arena of gender and sexuality is also structured by fractures, right? And so I think in, Pakistan right now, mainstream feminist groups are far more receptive to working with particularly trans women and issues confronted by trans women, but that historically has not been the case. And then I think that the fractures between mainstream feminist movements, whether more Islamic or more secular oriented, and the issues of queer rights, I mean, that fracture is still very deep and wide. So it's not just between the religious and the queer that we see sometimes friction or lines emerging, but also within the gender and sexuality side of that equation. And and then the religion side is also quite complicated. The petition or the backlash that's being articulated through this petition in the federal Sharia court seems to be a Jamaat Islami initiative, and then the position of the Jamaat Islami within the larger Muslim Ummah is also quite complicated and not necessarily a friendly one. I think that where we have seen sort of coalescence recently between religious parties or religiously minded folks and trans rights folks, many of whom are religious, is around issues trying to build and cement norms of respectability. So one of the things that I've been sort of struck by in a lot of the discussion is that whether it be led by the Supreme Court or by Muslim activists or by trans folks themselves, is that trans folks need to be brought into the mainstream of life. This is a discussion or a kind of a trope that is there throughout the Supreme Court discourse. And so again, trying to get trans folks into respectful jobs like educators or students or teachers or doctors, rather than doing things like begging or sex work and these sorts of things. So, respectability is a really tough area. We all want to be respectable, but it can also be suffocating. And so, where the alliances emerge, there's always, we have to think about what people are allying around and whether that works for everyone. So I'll just end there.
And I just want to say to those who might have joined us that if you would like to pose some questions, I'm going to be turning to questions in a moment. If you can also, if you also want to put them in the chat, we'll pick them up in the chat. But before we turn to questions, and I certainly have a few more myself, I want to pick up Elizabeth here and ask you to talk a little bit about what you've seen, both in terms of blurry boundaries between some of the activists on gender and sexuality issues and religious leaders, but also some of the brighter boundaries.
Yeah, thank you. I want to be clear that this isn't my research area, so I want to be very careful about what I say next. I really resonated, Karima, with what you were saying, in particular about because I work with a lot of artists, the sense that there are groups that are more leftist, secular in their activism. And, I think that as the Muslim community continues to mature in this location in Australia, if we are thinking about diaspora communities, and I say this as someone who's a convert, so I have a very different positionality from born Muslim women or born Muslims who may be queer, who are working within very different cultures, societies, families than I am. So, I think that there is a lot of tension, I think, between there are people who I think yearn for very strong Islamic leadership that is founded on Islamic jurisprudence, the Quran and Hadith, to talk about issues of gender and sexuality. But I think that there has been a lack of that, and I think that's quite evident for many diaspora Muslim communities in places like Australia and the US and the UK, other places, particularly in the West. So I think that tension for people who want to have their rights recognised and are pushing for those rights, and they are rights that are given to them in Islam, I think that there is a tension between wanting to have that and co-opting essentially what is Western feminism in particular, and Western queer rights. I think that there's a tension there. I experience that. And, when I talk to other Muslim women, particularly around ideas of feminism, if we're thinking, because my sort of research area is more in Black feminism and Indigenous feminism in particular, we're talking about all of these issues, transcultural, and just different ways of organizing, and how can we speak to one another. And we may want to co-opt Western feminism or Western queer politics, but how can we do that in ways that feel genuine to us as well? There are lots and lots of Muslim women, and there's lots and lots of Aboriginal women who reject the term feminism. I wouldn't say that they're not feminists, because they are pushing for, their rights as women, but they would reject notions like feminism, that kind of term. So I think it is just a tension. I'll leave it at that.
Great. Can I pick up before I let you go on
Sure.
The relationship between your work is multidimensional, right? It is interdisciplinary. It is academic, but also, as you said, you've come to the academy recently. You're also involved in literature and the arts and so on. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, in the Muslim community in Australia, when the Muslim community is looking at Muslim activists who are involved in the arts, particularly in the visual arts or in literature, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that relationship. On the one hand, we can see sort of younger Muslims perhaps being very comfortable in sort of engaging new forms of literature and sort of some of the more provocative forms of the arts. And on the other hand, perhaps there's a generational difference with some older members of the community. But in general, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how the Muslim community in Australia engages with activist artists, particularly activist Muslim artists.
That's a really big question. There's multiple layers, I think, to the answer. I think that the arts sector, there are different types of arts. And I think that for a lot of non-white people, you start off in a sector that wants to co-opt multiculturalism and work through the arts in that form. So that kind of work is very much about, we celebrate different cultures and, food and cultural dress and that kind of thing. And I think that there's a wide spectrum of arts. And then you have more established artists that are working with galleries, that are presenting at the Venice Biennale, that are, you know, going to Documenta 15 in Europe, all of those sorts of things. So that's quite a wide spectrum. And I think that there's different engagement from Muslim communities at different levels. And I think you are very right in terms of there are, I think some of it's generational. I think some of it is based on experience. We have a very long tradition of Islamic art. We have contemporary Muslim artists. And what does that mean? Does it mean that you are a born Muslim, but you're not a practicing Muslim? Does it mean that you are a practicing Muslim? Does it mean that you're someone who was born Muslim, but you may now not be a Muslim anymore? Like, what does that mean to be a Muslim artist, right, in a contemporary sense? So, but there are, I think there again are those tensions between people. Well, here's a good example. Literature, I think, is a very easy ask of pockets of the community who understand, because we come from a tradition that is about read. It is about read the Quran. It is about the way that we write. It is about poetry, all of those sorts of things. So literature becomes a very easy ask. If we're talking about gender, for example, it's very easy for people to say, oh, my daughter, she loves to read books. She wants to be a writer. That's a very easy ask, as opposed to my daughter wants to be a theatre maker and be on the stage and be an actress. They can be very, very different things. So I think there's just different levels to the way that works.
Sort of shifting from the artistic to the judicial. I want to sort of ask Jeff briefly, and we do have a question in the Q&A that I want to pick up as well. But Jeff, your work is in the courts, right? Your work is with judges and lawyers and so on. And in that context, the courts figure as a venue for change, right? And then there is a possibility, at least, of change. But we also know from work more generally that major institutions like the judiciary struggle with things like structural racism, structural exclusions. And I'm wondering if you're optimistic. I'm wondering if, looking forward, particularly in the context of South Asia and the direction the courts are taking, do you see the courts as a venue for vectors of change? Or do you think that increasingly the courts will be more status quo oriented, and therefore activism in its most effective forms might turn away from those formal institutions to some of the sort of civil society-based activities or the arts, which both Karima and Elizabeth have been talking about?
So before I answer that, I see the question in the chat room. Can everyone else see that? So can I kind of weave in that question?
No, not everyone else can see it. I think it's just come through to the panel here, but I'll go through it. It basically, the question that's come in from one of our visitors is how inclusive of gender diversity, particularly LGBTQ rights, do we think contemporary feminism, as it's articulated in Muslim contexts, might be? It sounds like it's becoming a little bit more inclusive than in the past, but how do we see efforts at gender inclusivity and gender diversity, particularly as it pertains to LGBTQI rights might be? And Jeff, you're well placed to address that.
Yeah, so I think one of the initial reactions to the Pakistan Supreme Court's interventions in 2009, continuing through 2012, was that it was just the pet project of one or two justices on that court, and that it wasn't going to have it wasn't going to be a self-sustaining or sustainable enterprise. So I think we have to be very dubious of courts for multiple reasons. But one hopeful sign is that this discussion in the Supreme Court has not only instigated, if you will, the legislation of the Pakistan Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act of 2018, but we see the norms and the respect articulated by the Supreme Court towards trans folks being replicated in lower courts across Pakistan in subsequent years, particularly the Lahore High Court, but not exclusively the Lahore High Court. And one thing that's even more sort of promising is that, and I discuss a case in my Melbourne Asian Review article, we see it percolating and down to even lower level courts. So, you know, the high courts and the Supreme Court in Pakistan are a completely different kind of beast, if you will, than the districts and sessions courts. And the level of professionalism, you know, as described by many people, is much higher in the high courts than it is in the district and session courts. But there are a few instances recently in which we have seen the district and session courts telling, for example, fathers who are accusing trans folks of trying to run off with the children of these fathers that, you know, listen, this is a marital choice that has to be respected. The fathers can't control the marital wishes of their daughters or sons. And so to see that kind of, you know, respect towards the gender identity choices and just the person, whether trans or not, in these lower courts is an encouraging sign. And so I'll say, you know, with respect to that question, you know, and how inclusive is mainstream feminism in these contexts? You know, as inclusive or, you know, as not inclusive as Western feminism is. And I think one of the healthy aspects of feminism in Pakistan is that there's still a sustained critique of marriage, which a lot of, for example, American feminism has just forsaken. So LGBTQ marital equality, you know, the entire value that gets stressed there is equality for understandable reasons, for good reasons, but the marriage aspect of that just drops out of the equation. Whereas I think, you know, feminism in Pakistan and India, for that matter, still has a lot more questions about whether or not marriage in the first place is a good institution.
Excellent. I have a question for Karima, which I'll pose, but after a question that's just come up in the chat. So let me foreshadow the question for Karima at the end. It's really a zooming out question, right? It sort of picks up on the fact that the world is watching sort of backtracking from democratic governance and a move towards authoritarianism in lots of contexts. And I think your work about activism in authoritarian contexts helps us sort of anticipate some of the challenges that lie ahead. And I'm wondering if you can just maybe, Karima, at the end, help us think about what activism in authoritarian contexts, particularly in the Arab world, looks like moving forward, right? What types of strategies, what types of issues are likely to be taken up and in effective ways, particularly in places like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Syria or Palestine, you know, where the context is, as you indicated earlier, not conducive to civil society action, but possibly leaving spaces for other types of activity in the arts and so on. But before we get to that, the question that's come up in the chat, I think, is a perfect question for Elizabeth. And the question is this: can any of the panelists speak to informal networks between Muslim Australian communities and Indigenous Australian communities? You know, for example, many Indigenous artists joined an anti-Israel boycott earlier this year, led by several Palestinian artists. And those types of sort of collaborations, I think, will attract attention. So I'm wondering, given your experience in lots of different spaces, Elizabeth, if you can tell us about informal networks that may be involved in different types of agendas, but also occasionally intersect and collaborate, and how those collaborations unfold.
Thanks. I hope you don't mind. I don't want to take too much time, but I just want to go back to the conversation before about kind of feminism and then also gender diversity.
Very quickly, with the mind that we have 4 minutes left.
Sure. I just wanted to say that I think that one of the things that we have to keep foremost in our mind is the different ways that patriarchy and misogyny can work. So I don't know, because it's not my research area, where patriarchy and misogyny within different Muslim communities, what the markers of that are. I'm very aware of where that works within kind of Australian society, where the markers and boundaries around patriarchy and misogyny exist. And I think within the Muslim community, there is some co-opting and adopting of Western patriarchy and misogyny. And so, you know, the kind of link, there's a separation between gender and sexuality, and there's also lots of overlap as well. Just wanted to say that. In terms of informal work, I mean, there's lots and lots of informal work that happens. There's also lots of formal work that happens, but because it happens outside of institutions and between communities, and it's not mediated by institutions and it's not mediated by whiteness, it's people can't see it as visible. But I'm involved in lots and lots and lots of different work. I think the solidarity that many Aboriginal artists have had, particularly with Palestine and with Muslim and Arab artists, is important. I think that that is based on those secular understandings of settler colonialism in particular. We are a settler colonial society in Australia, and many people are coming to understand Israel as a settler colonial society and country as well, and the parallels between genocide of Indigenous peoples in places like Australia and Turtle Island, North America and New Zealand, those kinds of genocides, and you know, the relationship between that and then what is happening in Israel as well. So I think that that exists. The last thing that I would say is that that exists because there's lots of work between people on the ground to educate and to bring people in. I think within the context of this place, the primary work that I have been involved in is Muslim communities, refugee and asylum seeker communities, migrant communities, educating themselves about what sovereignty, what dispossession, and what colonialism means in this place. That's a long time coming, because there was not that understanding for a very, very long time. So I just want to flip that around. It's not about Aboriginal people having to educate themselves about Palestine and what's going on. Actually, diaspora communities that live here in this place need to educate themselves about our struggle and work in solidarity with us, and we can reciprocate. But if it's settler colonialism, you know, people are part of that project when they come and they migrate here.
Again, sort of that global perspective on activism and solidarities and so on. And with that in mind, knowing that it has just struck 1 hour, I'm wondering if, Karima, you could briefly sort of
yes, quickly. I just want to say I completely agree with Elizabeth. I think I really appreciate her comment there. And just to go back very quick to the question that was asked of Jeff about whether feminist movement in the global south are being more inclusive, I would say yes. I think LGBTQ movements are always looking for allies, and I think feminist groups, particularly a diverse feminist group, are always the best ally. Now, going back to your question very briefly, yes, I think we've noticed post-2011 an entrenching of authoritarianism in the Arab world, particularly the rise of, toxic, I would say, toxic masculinity, like in the form of Sisi or Said al-Qais in Tunisia, which very much positioned the state as the patriarch, you know, the one that police women's bodies, first of all, you know, that you have to keep them under control, as well as working class men, you know, you activists, you have to keep them also under control. So in a sense, it's positioned the state as the moral arbiter, the one that produced the right form of Islam that should be practiced by the majority, the right form of activism, that create in a way forms of docile bodies, whether of men or women, and of course that very much police queer communities or transgender, because it wants to create that version of it as the one that police morality. So I don't see that, I see that it's actually exasperated forms of authoritarianism that are very much detrimental to women's rights, minority rights, particularly groups like queer communities. But I always see glimpses of hope. I see lots of new films, popular film that addresses this issue from various perspectives. I see lots of popular music emerging that very much open up the space for discussion. I see lots of young people leading on blogs, although they're always censored and arrested. So I think I see lots of things happening at the same time, and at the same time there is a strong coercive state surveying and controlling the activities of the citizens. So just very briefly, sorry if it's
no, very impressive in your brevity, given our time constraints. I'm just going to close now by thanking Elizabeth, Jeff, and Karima for a really interesting conversation. And Karima's sort of final remarks, I think, are a reminder of why we're doing this, and why we chose this subject. Because on the one hand, we do see a narrowing of the political space in lots of different contexts around the world. But with narrowing and constraint comes resistance. And therefore, it's important to understand how that activism will respond to the current trend. And looking at what's happening in Muslim communities in Australia, in South Asia, in the Middle East, really globally, helps us understand what's happening globally, but locally at the same time. And having an appreciation for both of those levels is crucial for academics and observers. So I'm just gonna conclude 3 minutes past our time. I'm going to conclude by thanking you again, Karima, Jeff, and Elizabeth, for joining us. Your comments have been extremely helpful, and hopefully we will all have a chance to reconvene. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Matt.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karima. Thank you, Annalise.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Elizabeth.
And thank you to all those who joined us.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Annalise.
Yeah, thank you for our guests.
Bye.